My name is Naomi Ferris, and I'm 33 years old. I close real estate deals for a living. I sit across from strangers at the biggest financial moment of their lives, and I watch their hands when I slide the deed toward them, because hands never lie the way mouths do. Last October, at my parents' 35th wedding anniversary party, my mother slid a folder across a rented white tablecloth and told me, in front of 40 relatives holding champagne, that all I had to do was sign. Just sign, Naomi. It's a formality. Your brother needs this more than you do. I looked down at the top page. It was a quitclaim deed. My name was already typed into the grantor line. My address was already typed into the property description. Someone had prepared this in advance, printed it, and brought a notary to my mother's anniversary party. And they were all standing there smiling at me like I already knew the plan. I didn't sign that day. What I found out over the next 6 weeks was so much worse than a favor between siblings, and it started with a folded piece of paper I almost didn't open. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one holding all the paperwork. If you have ever been asked to give up something you built while everyone around the table acted like that was the reasonable thing to do, this one's for you. Drop a comment and tell me you're here, and subscribe, because the second half of this story is the part where the people who understand made me find out exactly what I do for a living. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without Cardinal Grove. I bought my house on Larkspur Court when I was 25. It's a small brick 2-bedroom on a quiet street in the Cardinal Grove neighborhood outside Columbus. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine in the way nothing else in my life had ever been fully mine. I'd worked as a closing coordinator for 3 years by then, moved up to title agent, and I understood exactly what I was signing when I signed it. My father, Walt, co-signed the original mortgage application with me because my credit history was thin and the underwriter at the time wanted a second income on file. It was a formality, the loan officer told us, 90 days of seasoning and we'll refinance it into your name alone. That's exactly what happened. 11 months later I refinanced, my father's name came off the note and off the deed, and Larkspur Court became mine, fully, with a title report clean enough to frame. I paid down that mortgage for 8 years, extra principal every single month, until the balance hit zero this past March. I remember standing at my own kitchen counter reading the payoff letter twice, because I do this for other people every day, and it still felt different when it was my name on the letter. I told my parents I'd paid it off. I told them at a Sunday dinner, the same table where my brother Grant's news always got a toast, and mine usually got a nod. My mother, Carla, said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and passed the green beans. Grant didn't look up from his phone. I told myself that was normal. Our family runs on a particular kind of math, where Grant's setbacks count as effort, and my steadiness counts as luck, and I'd made peace with that math a long time ago, or I thought I had. I drove home that night with the payoff letter on the passenger seat, like a passenger of its own, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I had built something nobody could take from me. I want you to remember that feeling, because it's the last time in this story I had it without a catch. The anniversary invitation came 4 weeks later, gold script on cream cardstock. Walt and Carla Ferris request the pleasure of your company. 35 years. My mother had rented the community hall at St. Boniface, the same room where Grant's engagement party happened 2 years ago and never quite ended, in that his fiancée left him 8 months later, and the hall deposit apparently became a running joke about how the Ferris family always throws a good party regardless of outcome. I helped my mother pick the caterer. I drove 2 hours round trip to pick up her dress from alterations. I did what I always did, which was make things work without being asked twice, and I didn't think anything of the way she kept saying, almost offhand, "We'll talk business later, sweetheart. There's a family thing we need to sort out." I assumed she meant seating charts. The party itself started exactly the way every Ferris gathering starts. My father working the room with a drink he'd nurse all night. My mother stationed near the gift table, checking her phone every few minutes, like she was waiting on a delivery, and Grant arriving 40 minutes late in a suit that fit better than anything he owned 2 years ago, which I noticed and set aside, the way you set aside a crack in a foundation you're not being paid to inspect. My Aunt Dot cornered me by the punch bowl to ask when I was going to find a nice man and buy a bigger place, and I said I liked my house fine, and she said, in that voice relatives use when they think they're being kind, "Well, it won't be just yours forever, will it?" And I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say, and then letting it go, because the band started and my father was pulling my mother onto the dance floor, and for about 6 minutes it looked like an ordinary anniversary party. Then my mother found me by the coat rack near the back of the hall, away from the dance floor, and asked me to step into the little side room off the kitchen just for a second, she said. Family thing. I remember a folding table had been set up in there with a white cloth over it, out of place among the stacked chairs and the extra folding tables, like someone had staged a small ceremony inside a storage closet. There was a manila folder on the table. There was a woman I didn't recognize sitting in a chair beside it with a small case open in front of her, the kind that holds an embosser and a stamp pad. My mother closed the door behind us. She said, "This is Ms. Okafor. She's a notary. This will only take a minute. I want to be precise about what happened next because precision is my whole job." My mother opened the folder, slid the top document across the table, and said, "All you have to do is sign here and here. It's just a formality. We want to get your brother settled before your father and I aren't around to help him anymore." I looked down. It was a quitclaim deed. My legal name was typed into the grantor field. My address, 214 Larkspur Court, Columbus, Ohio, was typed into the property description, parcel number and all. The grantee field said, "Grant Walter Ferris." I have read thousands of these documents. I read this one twice before I trusted myself to speak, because for one full breath I genuinely believed I'd misread it, that this was some other property, some misunderstanding. It wasn't. Someone had pulled my parcel number from the county recorder's website. Someone had typed my legal name correctly, middle initial and all. Someone had planned this enough in advance to hire a notary and book her for a specific 15-minute window inside a rented hall. I said, "Mom, this is my house." She said, "We know, honey. That's why we need you to sign it over. Your brother's business needs collateral and he doesn't qualify on his own. This keeps it in the family. It's not like you're losing anything. It stays with us." I looked at the notary, who had the particular stillness of someone who does this job professionally, and has learned not to react to family arguments in small rooms. I said, "No, just that." My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of controlled flattening, like a door closing slow enough that you don't hear the latch. She said, "Naomi, don't make this difficult tonight of all nights." I said I wasn't making anything difficult. I was declining to sign a legal document I hadn't seen until 90 seconds ago, at my parents' own party, in a room with a folding table and a stranger with a notary stamp. My mother picked the folder back up, closed it, and said, "We'll talk about this tomorrow, like tonight, right now," in front of a notary she'd hired. Hadn't just happened. We went back out to the party and nothing about the room had changed. The band was still playing, the cake was still uncut, and I stood at the edge of the dance floor with my heart going like I'd run somewhere, holding a small paper cup of punch I didn't remember picking back up, watching my family celebrate 35 years, while a woman I didn't know packed up a notary kit in a side room, 20 feet away. By the time I got home from the party that night, the family group chat had already lit up without me. My Aunt Dot had sent a message to everyone except me, a slip I only found out about because my cousin Beth, who has never once in her life been able to keep a secret, forwarded to me the next morning with a single line of her own attached. "You should see this." In the thread, my mother had written that Naomi was being difficult about helping her brother, that it was disappointing after everything the family had done for her, and that she hoped Naomi would come around before Thanksgiving so things wouldn't be awkward. Nobody in that thread asked what she actually been asked to do. Nobody asked whether difficult meant declining to sign away a house at a party with a notary hired in advance. It just became a fact, passed hand to hand through people who loved the shorthand version more than they loved the truth, that I was the problem. My phone stayed quiet from people who used to text me constantly. Grant didn't call at all, not once, in either direction, which told me more than a phone call would have. I sat with that silence for 2 days, the specific loneliness of being cut out of your own family's story about you, before I decided the only thing worth doing with it was to stop reacting to what people believed and start building a record of what was actually true. I didn't sleep that night. I kept circling back to the same detail, the parcel number. You don't get a parcel number by guessing. Someone had pulled the county record, and I kept circling back to a second detail that bothered me even more, which is that the deed was already typed, already formatted, already printed on the correct legal size paper with the correct margins for recording. Someone in my family, or someone working for my family, had done this before, not necessarily to me, but this wasn't improvised. This was a template. The following Tuesday my mother called me at work, which she almost never does, and asked if I'd had a chance to think about the paperwork. I told her I wasn't going to sign a quitclaim deed on my own house, full stop, and asked her, calmly, who prepared it. She got vague in the specific way people get vague when they're protecting someone. A friend of your father's, she said. Somebody who does this kind of thing. I asked for a name. She said it doesn't matter, Naomi, and then she said something that I've turned over in my head every day since. She said, you have to understand, your father already told them it was handled. Told who it was handled. That question sat in my chest for 3 days before I got an answer I wasn't looking for. It came from a voicemail, not from my mother, not from my father, but from a woman named Priya Shastri at a company called Meridian Trust Lending, who said she was following up on documentation for the Ferris equity line and needed a call back to confirm identity before the funds could release. She left a case number. She left my father's name and, oddly, my own cell phone number as the secondary contact on file, which was strange because I had never applied for anything called an equity line in my life, at Meridian Trust or anywhere else. I called Priya back the next morning during my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking garage under my office because I didn't want anyone at work to hear my voice do whatever it was about to do. She confirmed, after I gave her my date of birth and the last 4 of my social to verify identity, that there was an open home equity line of credit application on file for the property at 214 Larkspur Court, Columbus, Ohio, in the amount of $85,000, listing me as the borrower, my father as a guarantor, and Grant Walter Ferris as an authorized additional signer for disbursement purposes. The application had been submitted 6 weeks earlier. It had been approved conditionally, pending recorded proof of clear title, which was the one piece it didn't have, because I owned that house free and clear, and nobody but me could produce a deed that said so. I asked her to send me everything on file. She said she'd need my written consent, given the sensitivity, standard procedure, and I told her I understood standard procedure better than most people she'd ever spoken to, because closing loans was my job, and something in my voice must have told her I wasn't the confused party here, because she pulled the file while we were still on the phone. The application had my name, my date of birth, my social security number, my employer, and a signature on the authorization page that was not my signature. It was close. It had the same slant, the same loop on the N, but I have seen my own signature notarized on 100 documents in my care, and I knew within 2 seconds that I had never signed that page. That was the moment the floor changed under me. Not the quitclaim deed at the party, bad as that was. This, someone had used my personal information, my social security number, my employer, details nobody outside my immediate family would casually have, to apply for $85,000 against a house I had spent 8 years paying off alone, and the only thing standing between that money dispersing and staying blocked was the fact that the deed on file at the county recorder's office still, thank God, said Naomi Ferris, sole owner, which meant the quitclaim deed at the party wasn't a favor, it was the missing piece. They needed my signature on that document to make the loan legitimate on paper, because without it, the whole application was sitting on a forged authorization and a property they didn't own. I called my closest friend from the industry, a real estate attorney named Delia Osi, who I'd worked with on closings for 6 years, and trusted the way you trust someone who's seen you handle other people's worst days calmly. I told her everything, the folder, the notary, the voicemail, the forged signature. She was quiet for a second, and then she said the sentence that changed how I moved through the rest of this. Naomi, you need to stop treating this like a family disagreement, and start treating it like a fraud case, because that's what it is, and the fact that it's your family doesn't change the first. elements. There was a strange kind of relief in finally having someone believe me without needing 3 days to process it first. Delia had spent 6 years watching me catch other people's mistakes at closing tables, missing signatures, mismatched notary seals, a name spelled 2 different ways on 2 pages of the same file, and she told me flatly that everything I'd described had the shape of a family that assumed I'd never look closely at my own life the way I looked at everyone else's. That's the part that stayed with me longest, not the anger, but the specific insult of being underestimated by the people who should have known exactly what I was capable of catching. Delia walked me through what to do without tipping my hand. Freeze nothing yet, she said, because a freeze alerts them we know. Pull my own credit report from all 3 bureaus quietly. Request the full loan file from Meridian Trust in writing, which as the named borrower I was entitled to. Order a certified copy of my own deed from the county recorder, current as of that week, to establish beyond doubt what the public record actually said. And say nothing to my parents or my brother until I had all 3 in hand, because the version of me that reacted emotionally in that side room at the party was the version they expected, and the version that said nothing and gathered paper for 3 weeks was the version they had never once had to deal with. I did all of it. The credit pull showed a hard inquiry from Mary Ian Trust I hadn't authorized, filed the same week my father supposedly co-signed my original mortgage refinance 8 years earlier, which told me something ugly, that whoever built this file had reused old documentation, my old Social Security card copy, my old pay stubs from a job I hadn't held in 6 years, all things that had passed through my father's hands back when he was helping me with that very first mortgage application. He'd kept copies. For 8 years, in a drawer somewhere, he'd kept copies of my personal financial documents, and when Grant needed collateral, someone had gone looking through that drawer. The deed came back exactly as I expected. Sole ownership, Naomi Ferris, recorded clean, no liens, no encumbrances, nothing pending except, buried on the second page in the pending instrument section, a notation that a quitclaim deed transfer had been submitted for recording 9 days earlier and rejected by the county for an incomplete notarization, missing witness signature. 9 days earlier, before the party. Before my mother ever handed me that folder, someone had already tried to file the transfer once, on a document I hadn't signed at all, and the county had bounced it on a technicality. The party wasn't the beginning of the plan. It was the second attempt, the one where they'd decided they actually needed my real signature this time, because forging it once had already failed and drawn the wrong kind of attention from a clerk who does this for a living. I sat with that for a long night. Somebody had tried to forge my signature on a quitclaim deed for my own house before they ever asked me. The party wasn't a request. It was a backup plan for a crime that had already been attempted once and hadn't worked. I still hadn't confronted anyone. I wanted to understand the why before I dealt with the who, and the why came from a place I didn't expect. A mutual friend named Renee who worked with Grant at his old sales job, and had since moved on, who reached out to me out of nowhere to ask, carefully if everything was okay with my family, because she'd heard through people at her new company, a regional bank downtown, that Grant's landscaping business, Ferris Grounds and Design, had an active judgment against it from a supplier for unpaid invoices, totaling almost $40,000, and that there was talk of a second, larger issue, something about a client deposit account that didn't reconcile. I hadn't even known Grant had client deposit accounts. I looked into what I could, which as a title professional with public record instincts turned out to be more than most people could. Ferris Grounds and Design had 2 liens filed against it in the last year. Its business checking account, according to a UCC filing I found in the public record, had already been used as collateral once, for a loan that was now in default. Grant wasn't asking to borrow against my house to expand a healthy business. He was drowning, and my house was the clean asset left within reach of anyone who shared his last name. I wanted a second source before I trusted any of it completely, because Renee had left that job on rough terms, and I didn't want to build a case for my own family out of someone else's grudge. So I did what I do at work when a title report throws up something that doesn't sit right. I went to the primary documents instead of the second-hand story. Ohio's Secretary of State site lets you search business filings for free, and Ferris Grounds and Design's annual report, filed just 5 months earlier, listed my father as an unpaid registered agent. A detail Grant had apparently never mentioned to anyone at Sunday dinner, and a detail that told me my father wasn't a bystander in Grant's business troubles. He was already formally, legally attached to them. I found the 2 UCC filings myself, cross-referenced against the county's own recorder database that I use every week for work, and they matched exactly what Renee had described: a defaulted equipment loan using a mower fleet as collateral, and a separate filing from a landscaping supplier for unpaid invoices. What I hadn't expected to find, sitting there at my kitchen table at 11 at night with 3 browser tabs open, was a small claims judgment from a homeowners association 2 towns over, $6,000, for a client deposit Ferris Grounds and Design had taken for a spring installation that never happened and never got refunded. That wasn't a business having a rough year. That was a business taking money from strangers and not delivering, and my brother had let it get that far before anyone in our family said a word to me. That reframed everything about the party. My mother hadn't been protecting Grant's ambition, she'd been trying to stop a collapse she was terrified of, using the one piece of collateral in the family that still had equity, mine, and she'd been willing to let someone forge my name to do it, rather than tell me the truth and ask. I want to be honest about the sacrifice this next part cost me, because it wasn't paperwork, it was a decision. I had every piece I needed at that point to go straight to the county, straight to the bank's fraud department, and straight to the police, and have this handled as identity theft and forgery within a week. I also had a father who was 61 years old, whose signature might or might not be the one on that forged authorization page, and I didn't know yet whether he'd done it himself, or simply let it happen and looked away. The way he'd looked away from 100 smaller unfairnesses at that dinner table for 30 years. I sat in my car outside the county recorder's office with a certified copy of my own deed on the passenger seat. The second time in this story, a piece of paper has ridden shotgun on my worst day, and I had to decide what kind of daughter I was going to be on the way to being the kind of person who protects what's hers. I decided I would get the airtight before I ever said a word, and that when I did say something, I would say it once, calmly, to everyone at the same time, so nobody could tell a different version to a different relative afterward. That decision cost me 3 more weeks of sitting on a truth that was eating me alive, being polite at a Sunday dinner I attended specifically to gather one more detail, watching my mother pass the green beans to a daughter she had tried to rob. The detail I was missing was who actually filled out the loan application, because Meridian Trust required the applicant's employer contact for verification, and the number on file wasn't my real HR department, it was a cell phone. I recognized the last 4 digits before Delia even finished reading them to me over the phone. It was my father's number. That confirmed what I'd suspected and dreaded in equal measure. My father hadn't just let this happen, he'd been the applicant of record. He'd used documents he'd kept from my first mortgage 8 years ago, filled in the employer verification with his own number, so no HR department would ever contradict the story, and either signed the authorization page himself, or handed my old documents to whoever prepared that quitclaim deed, and told them, as my mother had let slip on the phone, that it was handled. I asked Delia what my actual exposure was if I did nothing, and she told me something that made the decision easier, because the deed transfer had already been rejected once by the C. And because the loan was still sitting conditional, unreleased, no money had actually moved yet. That meant this was still legally an attempt, not a completed theft, which mattered enormously for what came next, because it meant I could handle this in a way that protected the house and exposed the fraud without necessarily sending my own father to prison for a completed felony, if that's the road I chose. Delia was very clear that the choice was mine, not automatic, not required, mine. I decided on my terms, not theirs. I asked Delia to help me draft 2 things. A formal written notice to Meridian Trust revoking any authorization on file and demanding the application be closed and flagged, which as the actual titled owner I had every right to do, and a letter, not to be sent yet, laying out every piece of evidence I had: the forged signature, the rejected filing, the reused documents, the employer number that traced to my father's cell phone. I asked her to help me get everything notarized properly this time. My own signatures, my own choices, nothing anyone else typed in advance. And then I asked my mother to set up a family dinner, the whole family, at my house, on Marksburg Court, my kitchen table, the one my father used to co-sign the mortgage on 8 years ago, and hadn't set foot in more than a handful of times since. She agreed, I think, because she assumed it meant I'd changed my mind. They arrived on a Sunday in November, my mother with a casserole she didn't need to bring, my father quiet in the way he'd been quiet since the party, and Grant, who came separately, 20 minutes late, in a jacket I now recognized as the kind of thing a man buys when he's trying to look solvent in front of the people he's asking for money. I let everyone sit down. I put out 4 folders, the same number of folders as people at the table, which I noticed my mother clock immediately, because she understood exactly what a folder on a table meant now. I told them I knew about the quitclaim deed submitted 9 days before the party and rejected by the county. I told them I knew about the $85,000 equity line application at Meridian Trust, the forged authorization signature, and the employer verification number that traced to my father's cell phone. I told them I knew about the 2 liens against Ferris Grounds and Design, and the client deposit account that didn't reconcile. I said all of it in the flat, even voice I use at closings when I have to tell a nervous buyer their inspection turned up a cracked foundation, because that voice has never once failed me, and I wasn't going to let it fail me at my own kitchen table. My mother went first, the way she always does, reaching for the version of events that made her the hero of her own emergency. She said they were trying to save the family, that Grant would lose everything, that I had a house and no children, and no idea what it meant to watch your son drown. I let her finish, then I asked her the only question I actually needed answered. Did you know Dad forged my signature? She didn't answer right away, and in the 3 seconds she didn't answer, I watched Grant's face do something small and involuntary, a flinch toward the table, and I understood before anyone said another word that Grant had known the whole shape of this plan from the start. Not just accepted a gift his parents arranged, but asked for it, described what he needed, and let his father figure out how. My father finally spoke, and to his credit, or what was left of it, he didn't lie outright. He said he never thought it would get that far, that he'd meant to ask me properly, and lost his nerve, that once the paperwork was started, it felt easier to keep going than to stop and admit what he'd already done. He said, I kept your old documents from the refinance because I didn't know we'd need them for anything like this. Like the keeping was the innocent part and only the using was the crime, and I told him, as gently as I could manage, that a man doesn't keep his daughter's social security card copy in a drawer for 8 years by accident. Grant tried the counterattack I'd braced for. He said I was being dramatic, that nothing had actually been taken, that I still had my house, so what was the harm? And he said the thing that told me exactly who he'd become somewhere in the last 2 years, that family doesn't need this much paperwork between them. I told him that paperwork is the only thing that ever tells the truth in this family, because words hadn't, not at the fridge for 4 years of magnet clippings, not at the party with a notary hidden in a supply closet, not in a voicemail from a lending company that had my cell number filed as a secondary contact I never gave them. He pushed back harder than I expected, standing up from the table, saying I'd always looked down on him, that I got the stable job and the paid-off house, and never once offered to help without making him feel small for asking. And for 1 second I almost let that land, because there's a version of me that spent 30 years absorbing exactly that kind of guilt on command. Then I opened the second folder, the one with a small claims judgment from the Homeowners Association, $6,000, a client deposit for work that never happened, and I asked him, in the same flat voice, whether that family he needed this much paperwork between him and was the family he told when he took a stranger's deposit and never delivered. He didn't have an answer for that one. My mother did though, and it wasn't the answer I expected. She looked at Grant for a long moment, something crossing her face that looked less like defense now, and more like the first real doubt I'd seen from her in this whole story, and she said, quietly, you told us it was a bank error, Grant. That was the first crack in the version they all agreed to tell themselves, and once it opened, my father didn't try to close it again. Laid out what I was going to do, because by then I'd decided and I wanted them to hear it from me before they heard it from a bank compliance officer or a county investigator. I had already sent Meridian Trust the revocation and fraud notice. The application was closed, flagged, and under internal review, and Priya Shastri had confirmed in writing that no funds had ever dispersed. I was not filing a police report against my father that night. I told him that directly, looking at him, not my mother, because he was the one who needed to hear it land. I said I wasn't doing it to protect him, I was doing it because I got to decide what kind of daughter I was on my own timeline, not his, and because the bank's own fraud unit, once they finished their internal review of a forged authorization on an $85,000 application, was required by federal regulation to refer confirmed cases to law enforcement themselves, whether I pressed anything or not. What I told him plainly was that his choice now wasn't whether consequences were coming, it was whether he cooperated with the truth before they arrived or after. Grant was a different matter, and I want to be honest that this is the part where the story stops being only about forgiveness. 2 weeks after that dinner, Meridian Trust's fraud investigator, a methodical man named Aaron Petrosky, who I ended up speaking with 3 separate times, confirmed that the loan application, the reused employer documents, and crucially, the digital submission itself had originated from an IP address registered to Ferris Grounds and Design's business office, not my parents' home. My father had supplied the old documents. Grant had built and submitted the application. The forged signature on the authorization page, when the bank's own document examiner compared it against samples, was assessed as most consistent with Grant's handwriting, not my father's. My father had told a version of events at my table that shrank his own part and left his son's largest part unsaid, and I understood, sitting with that report in front of me, that even in confession he'd been protecting Grant one more time, the same reflex that had put the fridge magnet up for 4 years and left my promotion letter in a drawer. Meridian Trust referred the matter to their fraud unit's law enforcement liaison, as federal regulation required once a confirmed forged authorization was documented on a completed financial application, regardless of whether funds had dispersed. I didn't make that call. I didn't need to. Grant was charged months later with identity theft and attempted fraud under Ohio law, a case built entirely on the bank's own investigation, the IP records, the handwriting analysis, and the county recorder's rejected filing that had, ironically, been the first thing that ever slowed him down. He pled to a lesser charge eventually, restitution and probation rather than the felony exposure he'd started with, because the loan never dispersed and because, his attorney argued, and I do believe this part, he had never done anything like this before, and was, by every account, including the ugly ones, a man in genuine financial freefall who made an unforgivable choice rather than a career criminal. My father was never charged. The bank's investigation concluded his role was providing historical documents under his son's direction, not knowingly executing the forged signature himself, though I don't think that distinction has ever once let him sleep easier, because I've seen him since, at a diner, just the 2 of us, and he looks like a man doing time in a sentence nobody else can see. The plea hearing itself was smaller and quieter than I expected justice to feel. I sat 2 rows behind Grant in a municipal courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee, and I watched him say guilty in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager getting caught at something, thin and stripped of the performance he usually wraps around bad news. The judge read out the restitution terms, the probation length, the conditions, and none of it looked like the movie version of consequences I might have imagined at the party with the notary and the folded table. It looked like paperwork, which I realized, sitting there, was exactly the point. The same instrument that almost took my house from me quietly was the instrument that quietly gave it back its safety, line by recorded line, filing by filing, until there was no thing left to argue with. My mother's account of that whole autumn, the version she still tells at the handful of family gatherings that still happen, is that I overreacted to a misunderstanding about paperwork. She hasn't apologized. Not really. Not the kind that names the thing it's sorry for. What she did do, the week after Grant's plea, was call me and ask, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, whether I still had the payoff letter from March, the one that said Larkspur Court was mine, free and clear, and I told her I did, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I'm glad it's really yours, Naomi." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I still don't fully. I've decided to let it sit exactly where it landed instead of turning it into something bigger than it was. Here's what the paperwork did and didn't do, because I don't believe in pretending a folder full of evidence fixes 30 years of a family running on unequal math. The deed on Larkspur Court has never had another instrument filed against it since. I checked, the way I check everything, with the county's online portal, more times than I probably needed to that first month. Grant is 2 years into a 5-year restitution schedule, working under his old boss at a landscaping company that isn't his own anymore, and I hear, secondhand, that he's actually good at the work when nobody's watching him do it, which might be the truest thing anyone's ever said about him. My father and I talk, sometimes, carefully, like two people rebuilding a bridge who both know exactly how much weight the old one could carry and don't trust the new one yet. My mother sends texts about recipes and never about that autumn, and I let her, because some silences are a kind of mercy you extend more for your own peace than theirs. I kept one thing from that whole ordeal that I never told anyone in my family about, not even Delia at first. The certified copy of my deed, the one that rode shotgun in my car for 3 weeks while I figured out who I needed to become to protect it, sits framed on the wall of my home office now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of a specific late night sitting in a parking garage, learning that the people who are supposed to protect what you build can sometimes be the ones you have to build your defenses against, and that the defense doesn't have to be loud to be complete. There's a version of the story where I burn the whole family down out of spite, and I understand why that version would be satisfying to watch. It isn't the one I lived. I chose the slower version, the one where I let a bank's own regulatory obligations do the part of the reckoning I didn't want on my conscience, and kept for myself only the part that was actually mine to decide, which was whether Larkspur Court stayed mine. It did. That was always the only outcome I was fighting for, not my father's freedom, not my brother's punishment, just a deed that said what it had always said. Beth, or anyone tried to change it. Everything else that happened to Grant, he built himself, one forged signature, and one unrefunded deposit at a time, and I've made my peace with the fact that consequences don't need my permission to arrive once someone set them in motion. I still work closings 5 days a week. I still watch people's hands when I slide a deed across the table, because I learned, the hard way, in my own family's kitchen, exactly how much can be hiding underneath a signature. Nobody bothered to check. That's my story. One folded quitclaim deed, one notary in a supply closet, and a family that found out the quiet daughter reads every line before she signs anything, including the ones about her own life. If this reminded you that love should never come with a signature line attached, take that as your sign to check the fine print on the people closest to you. Share it with someone who's ever been asked to sign something they didn't write. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.